Hey music friends, welcome back to the channel. It is back to school season. It is a slightly stressful season, I think, for a lot of private music teachers and studio owners and musicians. So if that's the case for you, I'm hoping that today alleviates a little bit of that stress, specifically around policy and contract. So if you don't have a policy or contract in place, we're going to talk about what to include and some of the options that you have, and also how to implement that for the first time. And we'll also talk about how to make updates to existing policies in case anything that we're talking about including in the policy and the options we discussed today are of interest for you and a fit for your studio business. Before we go any further, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so that you get notified when we post other helpful content like this. The first big question I get probably 4 or 5 times a week at this point is whether a studio should have a policy or a contract and what the difference is between either. In my own definition, I just say that a policy is something that is posted publicly with no signature. A contract is requiring either a physical or a digital signature on a document, stating that they agree to the policies that you're putting in place. In my definition, the only difference between a policy and a contract is whether or not you're requiring a signature. A contract would require either a physical or digital signature on a document, stating that they agree to the policies in that document. A policy does not require the signature. It can have all the same information, but you can just publicly post that and share it with your studio students, families, and clients, and you don't have to have the signature in place. Now, neither is better or worse than the other. If you want to have the signature in place because it provides a little bit more sense of security and it is another kind of layer of protection and reassurance, if you will, that someone actually read the document, understood it, I think it's a really, really helpful step to take. If you're like me and chasing down those signatures doesn't feel exciting, or every time you update the studio policy or every time you go into a new school year or annual year, if you just don't want to have to trace them all back again and track down signatures again from all your students and families, you also can just go the policy route, which is what I've done in my studio always. I've never preferred to have the signature, even though I understand, again, it's that extra layer of support and security. I also know I'm never going to teach a lesson for free, meaning if I haven't been paid for the lesson up front, I'm not teaching that lesson. So in my mind, I'm a little bit less stressed about the potential of teaching a month of lessons and looking for retroactive payment that never comes and needing that signature, that contract for some kind of next step with a family in that case. So for what it's worth, again, completely up to you, but my own personal preference has always been to forgo a signature, post my policy on my website, share it in studio update emails when I send them out, especially on an annual basis. And that has always worked really well for me in my studio. Now, what we include in either the policy or contract, which you'll probably hear me say policy from here on out just because it is, again, how I run my own studio and what a lot of the studios I work with tend to choose. But what is included in that policy has, again, some variation. But there are 3 core things that I would always recommend at a bare minimum be included in that policy. The first is your tuition, how it is structured, calculated, and paid. The second is any termination clause, so how students actually stop paying tuition and become no longer responsible for that tuition payment and how they communicate that with you. And the third and final thing is studio lesson cancellation policy. So what happens if a student can't make it to the lesson? Are there makeup lesson credits? What are the stipulations around that? There are other things that we can include. Of course, there's so much stuff that you could put in a policy or a contract. But I'm going to put a little asterisk on this conversation and say that, in my opinion, the more concise a policy is, usually the more clear a policy is. And ideally, we want it to be something that a new student or family could quickly scan, readily understand, and agree to. So we're looking at maybe 1 to 2 pages. Okay, anything beyond that, I think it's really safe to assume that it's not going to be fully read and understood, and it gets a little bit more complicated. Now, a really helpful way to keep your policy brief and concise is to really focus on the rule and not listing all the exceptions to the rule. In my brain, a studio policy should be the most strict version of yourself. Meaning, if I'm looking at my cancellation policy, I might ask for 24 hours notice to guarantee a makeup lesson. And that is the rule. I'm not going to then state, but if you're sick, not a big deal, just let me know, and here's how we handle that, and give additional information and context there. Those are things I can just handle on a case-by-case basis in enforcement when those situations actually come up. But by listing everything in the policy, again, sometimes it just gets really long, people aren't reading it, but also that can confuse the enforcement of the policy a bit too. For example, if I say that I only guarantee makeup lessons if someone gives 24 hours notice, but if they're sick, it's not a big deal and we'll figure it out no matter what. You might have, and obviously we want to think the best of all of our families and we hope this doesn't happen, but there is a potential that you could have people say that they were sick when they're not. Now, that can always happen, of course, but I think by including all those little exceptions to a rule, you open the door for people to maybe take advantage of those exceptions potentially. And again, we don't want to be that pessimistic. I certainly don't want to feel that way, but that's just something to know. It's easier to understand and read and process the policy if it's shorter. And also by stating just the rule and not the exceptions, it also communicates the boundaries in a really clear, firm, supportive way. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty on what to include in those policies, there are, like I said, some small sections that I like to include that are totally optional outside of those three core areas. The first thing that I like to state in my own policy is what my responsibility is as the teacher in the studio. Usually this is a very short section. I think mine is like maybe 3 sentences. It's very brief, where I'm just outlining that I'm going to provide a safe environment for students with a lot of encouragement and positive attitude in the studio, and that my goal is to empower students through music and give them materials and base their curriculum on their interests, their learning needs, and their goals. Really short, sweet, and to the point. Again, this is totally optional, but I like to include it in my policy because this is an important part of what I provide. And by including those little brief sentences at the beginning of my policy, I think it just sets the tone for everything else that comes after it. You can also outline student and family responsibilities. That's another helpful section to include. Again, totally optional. It is not required or even necessary by any way, shape, or form. Student and family responsibilities is another bonus section that can be really helpful, but it's definitely not necessary. My policy, again, here is very brief, just outlining that I'm looking for students to arrive on time, be prepared for the lesson, practice on a regular basis, although I don't include any kind of regulations or specific recommendations for practice length or frequency. That is handled on a case-by-case basis in lessons. But I also outline that as a clarinet teacher, they need to bring their instrument and all their music and their reeds, because I obviously can't replace that in the studio if they come without them. The most important segment, though, in that little blurb for me is I do ask parents, especially, that if there's something that's going on at home or at school with their student, that they just give me a heads up. And I know that feels so small, but it is, I think, a helpful bit of permission, if you will, to give a family that if there's something that's stressing the student out, or if there's something that me knowing would help support them more, I want to be aware of that. It's really important to me that I have all the information that's relevant to the student, because this is typically a pretty close-knit relationship between myself and the family and that student because of the one-on-one ongoing nature of private music lessons. So I always want to be aware if at all possible, and I include that in my policy as a result. Now, the final little bonus section that you can include is music and materials. And this is important for studios, especially if you're going to include anything in your tuition. For example, I work with a few oboe and bassoon studios that actually include a specific allocation every month of reeds for their students. And that is because, in case you're not an oboist or bassoonist, they are typically handmade by the teacher for their students. Now, this isn't true for all studios, but for many it is. And as a result, they are responsible for having a read prepared for their students when they need them. And they would rather have a set number every month that they're preparing so they can budget their time and resources accordingly than be getting like panicked last minute phone calls that we need to read immediately from students when one breaks during rehearsal or something like that. So usually they'll include a read or two per month to ensure that students have a really great stock and they're working with materials that support them so that we can prevent frustration or any kind of, mechanical needs and emergencies in lessons or in other playing and ensembles. Some piano studios also like to include music and materials in their tuition. I say piano specifically because I think with method books, which are more common for piano than a lot of other instruments, it's really easy to have subscriptions to a lot of these platforms. one that comes to mind right away is Supersonics, that allows you to just print off music as you need it within that series for students. So sometimes in that case, they'll include music in all materials in the lesson tuition. As a clarinet teacher, I don't do that. My student needs, a Henley edition of the Mozart Clarinet Concerto. It's going to be a pretty sizable sum that can be like $40 to $60 sometimes. So I don't budget that into my tuition or cover it at all. They also don't have to get the Henley edition. We would obviously follow whatever their state music ensembles and solo ensemble, things like that, are looking for. But prices vary on all of those, and I just leave it up to the student to purchase those, which is something that I do make note of in my policy very briefly as well. Okay, now to the most important sections. Let's start with tuition first. You do have options here, by the way. There's several different ways that we can structure tuition in a studio. I think the most common for studios that are just starting is to do what we call a per lesson payment, meaning weekly when the student attends the lesson, or however often they're attending the lesson, they just pay individually for that lesson as it happens. Usually this is coming through like check or cash, or business Venmo and business PayPal, because we do need to use the business version of those platforms, just as a quick little side note. It also could be something that is happening through a studio management software. Fonz, for example, supports per lesson automatic payment. So you can have the per lesson system and then also note how you accept payment and what that looks like. You also can include in that tuition policy a little note on what happens with tuition if a student does cancel the lesson. So if there's any cancellation fees, or any kind of period where the tuition is still going to run on auto pay, for example, if they don't attend. But it's important to note the structure of how often a lesson is happening and how often that payment is due as a result. You also could look at more of a tuition model where we prepay for either a package of lessons, like you could have 10 lessons in a package with maybe a slight discount versus the per lesson payment. You could also have a more semester or term-based tuition, meaning you look at the entire calendar for the next 4 months and have students prepay for that number of lessons. You can even do kind of like monthly payment plans for some of those things too. The first really important section in our tuition policy that is a must-have is tuition, how it is calculated, how it is paid, and what we do with any late payment or missing payment. When we look at tuition payment and strategy here, there are so many ways that we can structure tuition. Just as a quick example, you could do a per lesson payment where the lesson tuition is just paid as the student attends lessons on a weekly basis or however often they're coming. You could do a monthly proactive payment where you look at the number of lessons that are upcoming for the month and they pay at the beginning of the month for the upcoming lessons that are planned. You could do monthly retroactive, which is where they pay at the end of the month for the lessons that they received. You could do a package setup where maybe students buy 4 or 10 lessons at a time and they use those lessons in that package until it's gone. Sometimes studios will do like a slight discount. People buy more lessons in a bigger package. You could also do more of a tuition structure where you look at the entire semester or term or quarter and have students prepay, or even maybe use a payment plan, but pay based on the number of lessons that are planned for that set amount of time. So for example, if your fall term is August through December, for that period, you might have, let's say, 15 lessons that are happening, and students are prepaying at the beginning of August for those upcoming 15 lessons. The final option that is popular and common, and there are other ways of charging tuition, I'm just trying to cover some of the more popular options. My personal favorite is a monthly flat rate tuition. And the reason I say this is my favorite option is for 2 reasons. One, because it's flat rate, meaning it's always the same amount every single month. There's no variation. It's a lot more consistent for the revenue of the teacher. The second thing that I think is really beneficial about a monthly flat rate tuition is that you can put this on an automatic payment system because it is the same amount every month. And while there are options for auto pay, like on a per lesson basis, there are some studio management softwares that will support that, like Fonz, for example. I personally just really like the security of having the card on automatic payment and it's the exact same amount every month for the budget. I think it fully removes the money and the music and separates those, so we're not ever talking about tuition and lessons. And I also think it's a great option because you can make it more all-inclusive, meaning I can build in my hourly lesson rate for the lessons that are going to be received typically over the course of a calendar year, and we divide it into 12 equal installments. You'd want to outline how many lessons are promised over the course of the year, and then what else is included, like recital fees. If you're including reads or music, for example, that can be built in. So it's really helpful, I think, to have that all-inclusive tuition where it's just charged on the monthly basis and there's no add-ons. And the monthly flat rate tuition is a great option to make that happen. In your policy, obviously, like I said, you want to outline what that calculation looks like. So for example, if it's a flat monthly tuition rate, you would want to outline, as I mentioned, the number of guaranteed lessons over the course of the calendar year. You would also want to communicate how many lessons are not included. So for example, my studio policy guarantees 44 lessons, which provides me with 8 weeks off. And I like to tell families that if there's a week that we're not going to have lessons, they'll know that in advance. I usually tell them a few weeks in advance when I can, but also if it's teacher illness and it's a last minute situation, I just tell them as I know, and that's totally fine. You'd also want to include in your tuition policy whether or not payment is refundable. For most studios, it's going to say that tuition's not refundable. And if you're running on auto pay, you'd also want to outline how that is set up. So invoicing and payment will run on the first of the month, for example, every month from the card that they save on file. The final thing that I would include in your tuition policy specifically is what happens if there's a returned payment or a late payment. Usually a late fee, most studios will charge somewhere between like $10 to $25 per month for a late fee. If you are going to charge a late fee, usually that's happening automatically through studio management software like My Music Staff or Duet Partner or Fonz. So it's really helpful to outline what that is in your policy, not only the amount, but also the date by which that would run. So if it fails on the first of the month, if it's not paid by the 3rd, for example, or not paid by the 5th, then you're going to receive that late fee. Second really important section in your policy is a termination policy and a clause in that policy. So what happens if we're not going to continue lessons? Most studios that I work with will require 2 weeks written notice via email to stop an automatic payment plan. So if you're on that monthly flat rate tuition, it's running the first of the month every month, then you would require notice before the next tuition payment, meaning studios would have to know by the 15th of the month that a student doesn't want to continue for the next month. As a quick example, just to make this abundantly clear, if students are not going to continue lessons in September, they would have to notify you by email by August 15th as a deadline. So again, that's a helpful option. You could also require 2 weeks written notice before the last lesson if you wanted. I personally prefer to base it off of tuition because tuition is non-refundable in my policy, so it doesn't really make sense for me to say 2 weeks from the last lesson. The other advantage, though, is when we're running this kind of termination clause, I have time to wrap things up with the student to discuss what they should be working on ongoing if they're going to continue practicing independently, to transition them to a new teacher if that's the situation. And I also have time, just as a small bonus on the backside, to potentially fill that spot because I am aware that it's going to be available for the next month. So another helpful kind of piece of the puzzle. Final, really important section is your makeup lesson and cancellation clause and policy. I think it's really important to note that when you are looking at makeup lessons and credits and student cancellations, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just like tuition. There's a lot of personal preference here, but I do think it's really important that there is a policy in place around this so that students and families know what to expect and know what the boundaries are. Again, we're stating the rule. We're not stating the exception to the rule. In my own studio, I require at least 24 hours notice before a lesson in order to guarantee a makeup lesson. I also limit makeup lessons to 2 per term. And terms in my studio are September through December, January through May, and then summer, which would be June through August. Yes, I still have this policy in place, but I'm a lot more lenient on it because a lot of my students are traveling or attending camps in the summer, and it's just a little bit less consistent, the scheduling. I also have more flexibility in their schedules with daytime lessons to get those makeups done, so I'm not as stressed about it in the summer. But when we're looking at after school lessons in the school year, it's a lot more tricky. The limitation is helpful because if you have a very full studio, let's say it's 25 hours a week of teaching, and students are averaging 1 makeup lesson per month for every student, that's an additional 25 hours that you have to squeeze in other places. And while we can swap some lessons, it doesn't always work out that way, and it can just get really complicated, and it takes a lot of time and energy outside of your teaching to then be coordinating all those makeup lessons. So personally, I really like to limit the number of makeup lessons per term. Usually to 1 or 2 is really appropriate. You also don't have to provide makeup lessons. That's another option. I think that works really well with studios that are more full. just to be honest, and have more demand, or studios that also offer some kind of group studio class on a regular basis where students can get additional support and attention, or offer some kind of video exchange lessons. If you can't attend a lesson within that week, or even maybe by that lesson time, you would just need to send a little segment to the teacher and they would send a response back. So there are other ways of handling this that are not makeup lessons in the same way. But again, you have options. Just make sure that you concisely outline what the requirement is for a makeup lesson credit if you're going to give that, and then also add an expiration date. In my own studio policy, I say 30 days is how long they have to use that makeup lesson from the date the lesson should have occurred. As I mentioned before, the studio lesson policy, again, in my mind, is the most strict version of ourselves. So in that cancellation policy, what I'm not doing is listing any exceptions, like if a student is sick or if they have a school performance. Those are things I'm going to handle on an individual basis. Even if I have a no makeup lesson policy in place, if a student comes to me and they're sick and I have an opening in my schedule, I'm usually very happy to offer them that opening and just say, this happens to be available and I would love to see if it works in your calendar. Otherwise, can't always guarantee a makeup lesson. So it's great to just handle those things on a case-by-case basis. It does not have to be something that you are edifying in the policy by any means. The final note is if you choose to have students on photo or video anywhere on your website for social media, if you're recording recitals, you might also include a studio photo and video release. No matter what, I like to announce any updates roughly 4 to 6 weeks in advance of the change. Meaning, if I want an update on September 1st, I'm usually communicating that towards the end of July or early August so that students and families have plenty of time to read the policy updates and respond with any questions and bring any concerns to me as well. I also like to send a few reminders of this. I don't just send it at once. Usually I attach that in a studio update email with other information, and then also send a reminder just to say maybe a week or two beforehand, as a quick note, when you pay tuition for September 1st, these are the changes that also go into effect that you're agreeing to. That communication for existing students always for me comes through an email because it is written communication. It's helpful for me to be able to reference that and have everyone copied on the email. It's also helpful because it's searchable in a way that text messages are not. And also, of course, we can have face-to-face conversations about these things, but I want to have it in writing so they can reference it back and find it at any point. In that 4 to 6 week timeline, I'm usually just sending that communication via email. You can also have this posted in the studio or on the door of your studio just as a quick reminder to people. You can mention it in lessons like, hey, sent you an email, did you see it? But my personal preference is always to send the bulk of that communication via email because they can always search for it in their email inbox, find it again. It's in writing. I just think it's a really helpful way to give them space to read, comprehend, and then bring questions. If you're updating a policy, I would also follow the same timeline and also send that via email. All of that still applies. Most notably, though, what I would recommend in a studio update to a policy is in your update email or whatever information you're sending, have a section that outlines studio policies and gives the highlights. Attach the full brand new policy with all of the changes made, but also outline in maybe just quick little bullet points what specifically is being updated so that if someone doesn't click on the document or the link and read the entire thing, they still get that core information. So for example, my final recommendation on either implementing a policy for the first time or making updates to a policy that already exists is not to preview that it's coming until you have all of the document done. I find it to cause more confusion if we say to a parent, or a student, there's going to be changes to the policy because they say, what are they? And if you say, I'm going to have a flat rate tuition, and they'll say, what does that mean? And what does that include? And you don't have all those answers done, or you don't have the wording really solid yet, I think it creates a little bit more instability in that communication and relationship rather than announcing it all at the same time for all students and then answering follow-up questions in your lessons. I also, as a little side note on that, would not recommend polling students or parents on policy changes that you're considering. I think it's great to ask colleagues about what's working for them in their studio and in their studio policies and communication. But I think polling parents, which is something that I've seen studios try before, again, can create more confusion and also can create some potentially hurt feelings or frustration if they voted for something or expressed a desire for a policy that you chose not to use. But most importantly, no one can meet expectations if they don't know what the expectations are, and they can't respect your boundaries if they don't know what those boundaries are either. So by communicating this in a policy or contract upfront and sharing that with students and parents, I know it can be a little stressful to implement for the first time, but it really does yield more positive, successful relationships long-term, ongoing with the students and the families that you're working with. As always, if you are looking for support with your policy or your contract or any updates that you're looking at making, please feel free to use the resources that are linked below in this video from Outside the Box. We are so happy to answer questions and support you. I know it can be tough to implement for the first time or make changes, but whatever you're looking at doing, we can definitely share some resources and make sure that it's a very smooth process for you as you make these changes. I hope this video was helpful for you and your studio. Please like the video and subscribe to our channel so you can, again, get more notifications for content like this to support you in your studio ownership and music business. Bye, guys. Have a good rest of your day.